The monitors in the intensive care unit screamed their mechanical warnings into the sterile air, each beep marking another second stolen from a young life that had barely begun. Dr. Patricia. Morrison's hands trembled, something that hadn't happened in her 23 years of practicing medicine, as she watched the numbers plummet on the screen above the gurney. The boy beneath the tangle of tubes and wires was dying, and she was powerless to stop it. His name was Alexander Whitmore III, heir to a fortune that could buy entire city blocks. But all his family's money couldn't purchase the one thing he needed in the next 3 minutes: a compatible blood donor with an exceedingly rare blood type that only 3 in 10 million people possessed. "We're losing him," a nurse whispered, her voice cracking at the edges. Alexander's mother, Catherine Whitmore, stood frozen in the corner of the trauma room, her designer dress stained with her son's blood from the accident scene, her perfectly composed exterior finally shattered into 1,000 irreparable pieces. The car crash had been catastrophic, a drunk driver running a red light, a moment of impact that changed everything. And now her only child lay hemorrhaging internally while the city's blood banks came up empty. They'd called everywhere within a 100-mile radius. Type AB negative blood with the rare Rh null factor. Medical impossibility, they'd said. A needle in a haystack doesn't begin to describe it. Marcus Webb had been standing in the hospital lobby for the better part of an hour, his worn work boots leaving dusty prints on the pristine floor, waiting for news about Mrs. Chen from apartment 4B, who'd fallen down the stairs that morning. He'd been the one to find her, to call the ambulance, to ride with her because she had no family in the city. His daughter Emma sat beside him working on her homework, a second-hand backpack at her feet. At 42, Marcus's life could be summarized in a series of barely getting bys, barely making rent on their one-bedroom apartment, barely keeping food on the table with his job as a janitor at the elementary school, barely holding it together as a single father since Emma's mother had left when she was 2, but what he lacked in material wealth, he made up for in something Catherine Whitmore was learning couldn't be bought. The announcement came over the hospital's intercom system, desperate and unprecedented. Emergency appeal to anyone in the building. We have a critical patient requiring AB negative blood with Rh null factor immediately. If you've ever been told you have rare blood, please come to the main desk. This is life or death. Dr. Morrison had insisted on it, protocol be damned. It was a Hail Mary, a lottery ticket, a prayer screamed into the void. Marcus looked up from the magazine he wasn't really reading. Something clicked in his memory. A conversation from years ago at a blood drive the school had hosted. The nurse had flagged his results, told him he had extraordinary blood, that he should register with rare blood donor databases. But life had gotten in the way. Overtime shifts, Emma's school activities, the constant struggle to survive, and he'd never followed through. "Dad," Emma tugged at his sleeve, her 11-year-old eyes wide with understanding beyond her years. She'd heard the announcement too. "Isn't that what the nurse told you? About your blood being special?" Marcus felt his heart hammer against his ribs. He thought of the stack of unpaid bills on his kitchen counter, the shift he was supposed to start in 30 minutes, the way his boss had warned him, that one more absence might mean looking for new employment. He thought about Emma, who needed him, who depended on him for everything. What if something went wrong during the donation? What if there were complications? Who would take care of his daughter? But then he thought about another parent somewhere in this building, whose child needed them tonight, and might not see tomorrow. He stood up, his decision made in the span of a heartbeat. "Stay here, sweetheart. I'll be right back." As Marcus approached the main desk, a nurse intercepted him with barely contained urgency. "You think you might be a match?" 5 minutes later, they'd confirmed it. His blood type matched perfectly, a medical miracle walking through the door in steel-toed boots and a janitor's uniform. The odds of it were astronomical. Dr. Morrison actually gasped when she saw the lab results. But then came the conversation that would define everything that followed. "I need you to understand," she told Marcus in a quiet corner outside the trauma room. "This is not a standard donation. The patient has lost massive amounts of blood. We need significant volume, and we need it immediately through a direct transfusion to save time. It's taxing on the donor, and given your build and current health status, it could be dangerous for you. Marcus was already rolling up his sleeve. How long will it take? The doctor hesitated. We can do this in stages if needed, but the patient has minutes. If you're willing to do an aggressive donation, do it, Marcus interrupted. Whatever he needs. They brought him into the trauma room, where Catherine Whitmore stood vigil over her dying son. She barely registered the man being positioned in the bed next to Alexander's, barely noticed anything beyond the monitor that kept dropping. The nurses worked with practiced efficiency, inserting the needles, connecting the tubes, starting the transfusion. Marcus watched his blood flow through clear plastic, tubing toward a boy he'd never met, and felt a strange sense of rightness, despite the growing lightheadedness. Alexander's monitor began to stabilize. The numbers crept upward. Dr. Morrison released a breath she didn't know. She'd been holding. "It's working," someone whispered, as if speaking too loudly might break the spell. But Marcus was fading. The aggressive donation rate was taking its toll faster than anyone had anticipated. His own monitor started alarming. "We need to slow the rate," a nurse insisted. Marcus shook his head, even as his vision began to blur at the edges. "Keep going." "How much more does he need?" His voice came out weaker than he intended. Dr. Morrison was torn between her two patients now, the millionaire's son, whose color was returning, and the poor man, who was giving everything he had to a stranger. "Mr. Webb, your body is going into shock. We need to stop." "No," Marcus insisted through graying consciousness. "Not yet. Not until he's stable." Emma had disobeyed her father's instruction to stay in the lobby. She stood in the doorway now, watching her father save a life at the risk of his own, tears streaming down her face, understanding that this was who he was, who he'd always been, the man who gave everything even when he had nothing to give. Catherine Whitmore finally looked up from her son and saw Marcus for the first time. Really saw him, saw the worn clothes and calloused hands, saw the little girl in the doorway with tears in her eyes, saw a father risking everything for her son. She moved to Marcus's bedside, took his hand in hers and whispered, "Why? You don't even know him." Marcus's eyes found hers, unfocused but determined. "Because he's someone's son. Because you love him. Because it's the right thing to do." His words were simple, but they carried the weight of a philosophy that had guided his entire life. The belief that every life had equal value, that kindness wasn't transactional, that humanity meant showing up for each other, even when it cost you everything, especially then. Dr. Morrison finally made the call to slow the transfusion. Alexander's vitals were holding steady. His life was no longer hanging by a thread. Marcus had given enough, perhaps too much. They spent the next 40 minutes stabilizing him, administering fluids, monitoring his heart rate as it gradually returned to safer levels. When Marcus finally woke up fully several hours later, Emma was curled up in the chair beside his bed, her homework scattered around her like fallen leaves. Dr. Morrison came in to check on him, a smile on her tired face. "You saved his life, Mr. Webb. Against all odds, you saved that boy's life." Marcus tried to sit up, winced, and settled back against the pillows. "Is he going to be okay?" The doctor nodded. "He's stable. He'll make it now, thanks to you. But, Mr. Webb, you came dangerously close yourself. Your dedication was extraordinary, but you need to understand how serious that was." He looked at Emma, still sleeping, and felt the familiar weight of responsibility settle back onto his shoulders. "I know. I'm sorry if I scared anyone. I couldn't stop knowing he needed it." The door opened, and Catherine Whitmore entered, looking nothing like the polished socialite from the trauma room. Her makeup was gone, her hair was disheveled, and her eyes were red from crying. But there was something else there too, a transformation that profound gratitude brings. She approached Marcus's bed with uncertainty, as if unsure of the protocol for thanking someone for your child's life. "Mr. Webb," she began, her voice trembling, "I don't have words for what you did tonight. My son is alive because of you, because you were willing to risk everything for a stranger, Marcus shifted uncomfortably under the weight of her gratitude. Anyone would have done the same thing. Catherine shook her head firmly. No, they wouldn't have. I've learned something tonight about the difference between value and worth. My family has more money than we could spend in 10 lifetimes. But we couldn't buy what you gave freely. You have a beautiful daughter, Mr. Webb. You're a good father, a good man, and I want you to know that my family will never forget what you did. Over the following weeks, as both Alexander and Marcus recovered, an unlikely friendship formed between the two families. Catherine learned about Marcus's struggles, the mounting bills, the precarious employment, the constant juggling act of single parenthood. She learned about Emma's dreams of becoming a teacher someday, about Marcus's quiet pride in his work, about a life rich in love despite material poverty. Alexander, awake and healing, learned about the man whose blood now flowed through his veins, and felt humbled in ways his privileged upbringing had never taught him. Marcus was initially resistant to the Whitmores' attempts to help. His pride bristled at the idea of charity, of being someone's pet project or redemption story. But Catherine was insistent and, more importantly, sincere. "This isn't charity," she told him one afternoon in the hospital cafeteria. "This is family. You gave my son his life back. Let us help make yours a little easier. Not as payment, what you did is beyond price, but as thanks, as connection, as what people do for each other." Eventually, Marcus accepted. Not a handout, but a hand up. Catherine used her connections to get him a better job with benefits and stability. She established education funds for Emma. But more than the material help, she gave something more valuable: community. The Whitmores and the Webbs became genuinely close, bridging a divide that seemed impossible before the night that changed everything. Alexander, once a privileged teenager who'd taken his advantages for granted, was transformed by his brush with death and the knowledge of Marcus's sacrifice. He started volunteering at the community center in Marcus's neighborhood, began seeing the world through different eyes, understood that his life had been given back to him for a purpose beyond just existence. He registered with rare blood donor databases, determined to pay forward what Marcus had given him. Marcus eventually told Emma the full story of that night, why he'd made the choice he did, even knowing the risks. "Sometimes, sweetheart, we're put in positions where we can make a real difference, and when that happens, we have to step up, even when it's scary. Especially when it's scary. That's what it means to be human." The local news eventually picked up the story, though Marcus tried to avoid the attention. The coverage sparked a surge in rare blood donor registrations across the city. Other lives were saved because people were inspired by an ordinary man who'd done something extraordinary. But for Marcus, it wasn't extraordinary at all. It was simply what needed to be done. On the 1-year anniversary of the accident, both families gathered together. The Millionaire's family and the janitor's family, brought together by blood and choice, by crisis and compassion. They'd become something neither of them had expected. Evidence that human connection transcends social boundaries when we let it, that kindness creates bonds stronger than circumstance. Alexander stood to make a toast, his voice strong now. All evidence of his near-death experience erased, except for the wisdom it had granted him. "A year ago I almost died, but I didn't, because a man I'd never met decided my life was worth saving. Marcus taught me that heroes don't wear capes or live in mansions. They wear work boots and show up when it matters. He taught me that real wealth is measured in what you're willing to give, not what you have. Thank you, Marcus, for my life. Thank you for teaching us what really matters." Marcus, still uncomfortable with praise, simply raised his glass and smiled at Emma beside him. She was thriving now, her future secure in ways he'd never been able to provide alone. But he knew, and she knew, that what really secured her future wasn't the Whitmores' help. It was the example he'd set that night in the hospital, the lesson that love means sacrifice, that life has value beyond measure, and that sometimes the poorest among us are the richest in the things that truly matter. In the end, the story wasn't really about money or class or the dramatic reversal of fortunes. It was about the 3 minutes when a choice was made, when a man with nothing gave everything, and when humanity revealed its best self in the fluorescent light of a hospital trauma room,